an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I want you to think about this. Canadian forestry has a role to play in saving the planet.
Absolutely. The answer is yes.
Welcome to this Story Studio Network podcast series. I'm Dave Trafford. In this series, Aaron Trafford and I will explore a number of ideas that hinge on the notion of Canadian forestry helping to save the world.
There's no path to a net zero carbon economy without the forest sector and forest products, full stop.
We'll talk about how and why Canadian forests have the ability to shift the climate crisis and the economy to build a better future.
There is no machine and no process known to man better than a tree that's sequestering carbon.
We'll explore innovations in forest management that drive a green economy and directly address the climate issue.
We have a significant amount of the world's forest land. With that privilege comes the responsibility of taking care of it.
So welcome in to this special series produced for Forestry for the Future. We are here to tell the story of forestry for the future. But before we do, I really want to include you in our story. And just so the audience knows, I grew up in a forestry house.
Kind of like a feral lost boy from Peter Pan.
Well, some days, yes, it was like that. But you know your grandmother, not really a great fan of the feral. Now, imagination, curiosity, for sure. But there were more than a few rules in the house. And some of those rules actually apply to our relationship with the forest. And when we were kids, well, we still do. We call it the bush. So I know you know this, but for the sake of the audience, I just want to lay things out for them. My dad was a professional forester. Spent 37 years, entire career, working for the Department of Lands and Forests, which morphed into the Ministry of Natural Resources here in Ontario sometime in the 70s. He spent the bulk of those years working at Queen's Park in downtown Toronto. I mean, the nice trees in Queen's Park, but it really wasn't the forest. So he spent it right down in the urban center. But those years were bookended by stints in Northern Ontario. First in Chapleau, and then in Sault Ste. Marie.
So, of course, I have awesome memories of all the summers that we used to spend with him and Nan up in Grocap, kind of like a little bedroom community. It's just west of the Soo, out near the airport. And a lot of our entertainment happened on hikes and dirt bike rides and all that stuff back in the bush and along that shoreline there at Lake Superior.
So I'm telling you all of this because my dad's gig, believe it or not, was to count trees. Seriously. He was 17 years old, and he was a certified scaler, which means it was his job to go into lumber camps and measure the amount of timber that had been cut. So the official description on the Government of Ontario website, by the way, if you want a job as a scaler, there's jobs open. A scaler measures wood products to determine the scale, volume, and quality, grade, of the wood in order to produce a net volume of saleable wood. So it was a pretty important job in the whole process of going and harvesting forest and making sure it got to market. And at the time, he was the youngest in the province to be certified as a scaler, and we're pretty sure that the distinction still holds. But 37 years later, he never really wavered from the path because when he retired, he led the Forest Resource Inventory Department. Yes, he was still counting trees. So we grew up in a forestry house.
And that is exactly why we are so excited to be exploring this entire project with the folks at Forestry for the Future.
Yeah, initially we kind of thought this was going to be like Old Home Week, right?
We did, but the truth of the matter is that none of this turned out quite the way we expected it to.
No, not quite.
For all we thought we knew about our place in the forest and the forest's place in the world, our curiosity was quickly piqued at some of our earliest production sessions for this show.
Yeah, well, the bottom line is, I know I did, and I think you did. We learned a lot in the course of producing the series.
I think that's an understatement. And above all, we learned that the forestry sector and the wood processing industry can be a major player in the fight against the climate crisis. And I know this sounds counterintuitive, but cutting down trees can help save the planet. What? Huh? Cutting down trees can help save the planet.
Oh, wait. What about the Lorax?
Who'd you say you were, little fella? Mister, I am the Lorax.
You know.
I speak for the trees.
The guardian of the trees. He came from the creative brain of Dr. Seuss, the 1971 book made into a cartoon movie in 72. And it called on all of us to protect and preserve forests from planet-killing pollution, right?
So the Lorax wasn't exactly wrong. Deforestation, totally bad for the planet. And the message that individuals can make a difference was a very important part of that story.
Unless someone like you cares a whole awful lot, nothing's going to get better. It's not.
Okay, both are true. And the antagonist in this story realizes that the environment can be rejuvenated by growing more trees.
Treat it with care. Give it clean water and feed it fresh air.
Great message. But the parting shot in the story equates tree cutting with killing the planet.
Grow a forest. Protect it from axes that hack. Then the Lorax and all of his friends may come back.
Cutting down trees equals killing the planet.
Yeah, and so more than 50 years later, Dr. Seuss was right. Pollution will kill this planet. Unless...
Yes, unless...
we do something about it. Today, climate crisis is immediate, and the need for action is urgent.
Interesting that the timing and the tone of Dr. Seuss's simple story, though, it created an emotional framework for an environmental movement, a nascent environmental movement, and helped put the forestry sector on the defensive.
The forestry industry's image was boxed in and then defined by this cultural perception in a kid's book. Only the true environmental activist protects all forest at all costs from axes that hack.
Yeah, that narrative took on a life of its own in books and movies that followed.
My name is Lacey Rose, and I'm the county forester for the county of Renfrew in Ontario.
We talked to Lacey Rose for this series. She's a forester in Renfrew County in Ontario. And she admits her earliest impressions of forestry and the business of forestry came from movies.
Every generation has a movie that they saw that gave them a negative impression of forestry. Mine was Fern Gully. Maybe you read the Lorax.
And even when she was in school, the images and the information about forestry itself were quite limited.
And I remember what I learned in high school about forestry was in economics, and it was a picture of a clear cut in an economics textbook. And that is all I learned about forestry.
The image of that clear-cut forest is not pretty. So it's easy to see how that image, along with the protect the trees from the axes that hack message, can put the forestry sector and the related wood product business sector in a tough spot here in Canada.
So what's the good news story here? How can the forestry sector claim it's a leader when it comes to fighting climate change?
Canadian forests will play a role in our future climate.
Well, we talked to Paul LeBlanc. He's a forester in Manitoba.
My name is Paul LeBlanc. I'm the district forester here in Swan River, Manitoba, and I work for Louisiana Pacific Canada Limited.
And he says growing and managing healthy forests are the best way to reduce carbon in the atmosphere.
There is no machine and no process known to man better right now than a tree that's sequestering carbon.
So not to go too far down into the scientific weeds here, but trees absorb carbon dioxide and water through their leaves. Energy from the sun converts that into the sugars and nutrients that feed the tree. Now, the cool thing about trees is that the trees will release the oxygen, which is the O2 in the CO2, and contain the carbon, which is the C in the CO2, right within its wood.
Trees basically are carbon-sucking machines.
But there's a catch. Derek Nighbor, at Forest Products Association of Canada says that carbon gets released back into the atmosphere when the tree dies.
They do reach a point when they get older where their ability to store carbon diminishes. And when those trees become unhealthy or when they die, that carbon is then emitted back into the atmosphere.
Managing the carbon capture then is at the heart of managing, maintaining, and renewing healthy, sustainable forests.
My name is Peter Moonen. I'm the National Sustainability Manager with the Canadian Wood Council.
And a key part of any management plan includes harvesting the forest. Yeah, cutting trees in a planned and measured way is good for the forest and the environment.
The forest sector and the wood sector is not just about cutting down trees, but you have to do that. Because if you don't do that and you still want to have a house or a building or an office or a manufacturing plant, what are you going to use that is less damaging than wood from well-managed, certified, productive forests?
Can I just insert here, I did a Twitter poll while we were preparing for this show, and I asked, do you think that cutting trees can actually help save the climate? 87% of the people who responded to my poll said no. So if you were one of those 87%, pay attention. A properly planned and managed forest not only reduces CO2 in our atmosphere, it helps capture carbon for decades, maybe even centuries. You may not even be aware of what you're doing to reduce emissions, just based on the carbon captured in the wood products you are using all the time.
It's captured in the literal house you live in, most certainly in things like the framing and the roofing, and maybe even the table, the kitchen cabinets, the counter, the flooring, the heirloom coffee table in your living room, your IKEA bookshelves, the books themselves on those shelves, the upright piano, the acoustic guitar that you like to play. You get the idea.
Yeah, they're all there. They're idly storing carbon that was captured when that piece of wood, which is now a beautiful piece of art, whatever it might be, was still a living, breathing tree.
So the next interesting thing is that we've learned builders and architects are now using a relatively new product called mass timber.
My name is McLaven. I'm an architect by training.
It's become the product of choice for architecture firms like MGA in Vancouver with a focus on sustainable design.
I am a senior associate and head of R&D at Michael Green Architecture. Have been and always will be passionate about sustainable design, and that's kind of one of the core values and principles of MGA.
So now we're talking about these large urban office buildings, apartments, hospitals using mass timber as a primary construction material. It's a manufactured wood product. Essentially, it's like large sheets of laminated wood.
Where we take small pieces of wood, anything from dimensional lumber to wood strands, and we glue it together and we refine it and calibrate it in a very specific engineered way.
And by combining different species of wood in this process, that accelerates the carbon capture effect.
Typically, mass timber products would be working with younger trees that grow quickly, that grow faster. So we're able to kind of keep that carbon cycle going.
Also, that creates a strong, durable building product.
That's similar to the strength of steel and concrete.
And using mass timber means less time spent on the construction site because each piece is pre-cut by the manufacturer based on the plans, the blueprints, the 3D models developed for the project.
Sindhu Mahadevan also told me that there are companies right now, this blew my mind, they're developing 3D printing processes to create wood products. So the innovations in this area are pretty exciting, and they're going to go a long way to making the most of the tree because the 3D printing relies on the waste from the forest.
And the other cool thing, feather in our cap, is Canadian timber produces some of the best wood to create this mass timber.
Properties that come with that northern, colder forest and that longer growing cycle bring about properties that make the product more durable, more easy to work with, and that's why it's sought after.
So we've learned that cutting trees, that is harvesting forests, as part of a broad-ranging forest management system is not only good for the environment, it goes a long way in our efforts to reduce our carbon footprint.
Also, though, it means making sure our forests are renewed and regenerated, which we haven't talked about this yet, but this also means reseeding after a harvest.
My name is Kerry McLaven.
So we want you to meet Kerry McLaven.
I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Forest Gene Conservation Association.
Kerry's team oversees the collection and the harvest of seeds, so foresters have access to the right kind of tree seed when and where it's needed in order to ensure we've got healthy, sustainable forests.
We do need to make sure we manage them sustainably so that there is that population that can reproduce healthily and continue to contribute.
Preserving and promoting the healthy seed is a critical element when we talk about the life cycle of the forest. But Lacey Rose also says it requires a generational view to make sure today's plan supports our forests decades, even centuries from now.
We do long-term modeling, making sure that the actions we're taking today are not going to have a negative impact on the forest of tomorrow.
And of course, that modeling has become all the more important, if not complicated, in the face of a changing climate. Kerry McLaven says that means we need to be active and intentional in our efforts to support and promote healthy trees in our forests.
We're changing the climate so much, so we have to be part of the solution, not just standing back and watching them do their thing.
And the good news is Canada's in a great position to take a global leadership role in long-term, innovative forest management practices. This country has more certified forests than any other place in the world. Yes, we certify our forests, and a vast majority of them are on Crown land.
More than 90% of forestry done in Canada is done on public land. That's land we all share.
Derek Nighbor is comparing that to the United States, our neighbors to the south, where 80% of their forestry is on private land. So because you and I own so much of our forest, it actually comes with more accountability on how they're managed and developed.
I'm Jennifer Tallman, and I'm the Chief Forester for Ontario with Inter4.
Jennifer Tallman will go so far as to tell you we expect, you and I as non-foresters, expect good stewardship as a nation.
I think as a country, we really take seriously managing that land for the greater good of the public.
She'll tell you our values as Canadians inform the values in our approach to forest management.
It is not industrialized where you go in and cut it down and kind of walk away. It's very much managed for all aspects, whether that's like the social, the economic, and the environment. And I would argue that probably the social and the environment side are always managed a little more than the economic.
Okay, so we've got loads of great voices talking about all these innovations in forestry that create things like new jobs, spin-off industries. We hear how healthy, sustainable forests can and will play a role in fighting the climate crisis. We're starting to understand how Canada's forestry sector in particular can be that global leader.
But we haven't touched on the one thing that so often puts forests front and center in the headlines.
Newfoundland battles its largest blaze in 60 years as wildfires rage from coast to coast.
In the lower mainland, take a look at this. Jaw-dropping images from a drone taken above Prince George. The city now on the front lines.
Near Los Angeles is one of more than 48,000 wildfires started across
most of the area we're not able to access with bulldozers, so we're having to send in crews on foot to construct direct.
The UK is now the latest European country to battle wildfires, this one on the outskirts of London, destroying homes amid dangerously
record
dry
high
conditions.
temperatures are fueling wildfires in Western Canada.
That makes 2022 the most active wildfire season in more than 10 years.
Yeah, you know, there was a time when we talked about a wildfire season. Not so much anymore. The warming climate has led to a persistent drought in so many parts of the world, creating tinder conditions almost year-round.
Lives, livelihoods are being lost at an alarming rate. Billions of dollars in both private and commercial properties being destroyed. To call it a disaster is a bit of an understatement.
So you'll remember, my dad's the forester, right? Well, when he was in his younger years in his career, he was among the crews deployed to fight the bushfires in the name of public safety and the health of the forest. So I was a bit surprised when I talked to Landon Shepherd.
I'm the fire and vegetation specialist in Jasper National Park, working for Parks Canada.
He's focused on managing the forest in Jasper National Park, but the first word in his job title is fire and then vegetation. He says our notion of fighting fires is an outdated approach. In fact, he'll tell you we need to understand the role fires play in the renewal of a healthy, sustainable forest. And of course, forest fires are dangerous. They are destructive, but they have always been part of the natural forest life cycle.
I would think of it as most purely an element of change, and you can add to that and give it a positive spin and say it's a force for renewal and resetting certain ecosystems and restoring certain ecosystems.
In fact, he'll tell you we need to view it as an element of change that can be good for the environment.
With a fire, you are getting a renewal process that largely leaves the soils mechanically intact. So it's going to result in a different natural regrowth pattern because of that treatment by fire, both because you're chemically having a difference in terms of what the soils are going to be left with post-fire, as well as the amount of residual coarse woody debris that is left behind following most fires.
Okay, so if I'm hearing him correctly, we need to work with nature and take more natural historical fire patterns into account in the planning stages.
Yeah, and in doing so, it means that Canada's foresters can actually mitigate the impacts of these large forest fires and help our forests build resiliency. In fact, we're going to hear from some in Canada's forestry industry who also go so far as to consider the traditional Indigenous use of the way we use fire to manage forests. And some will tell us we need to harvest more if we're ever going to put a dent in our net zero carbon goals. One of those voices is Mahima Sharma.
I work as the Director of Environment, Innovation and Mill Regulations at the Forest Products Association of Canada.
She says we could learn something from the forestry practices in the Nordic countries in Europe.
Our friends in Sweden and Finland, they have forests that are much smaller, but they harvest 6 to 8 times the timber volume per forest hectare than Canada does.
They are harvesting 7 or 8 times the amount of trees annually that we do in Canada.
But at the same time, Sweden's net annual increase in stored carbon in Swedish forests, it reduces their national GHG emissions by 70%.
They're actively managing their forests. They're doing what's called climate smart forestry.
And Dr. Jamie Stephen is the managing director at Torchlight Bioresources.
If we look at what's going on in Canada is actually the amount of carbon stored in our forests is decreasing.
His research suggests forest harvesting in Canada is on the decline. And if we're not careful about it, it means more forests are affected by fire, more affected by pests, and that means more carbon being released into the atmosphere.
So what you're saying is there's more work to be done.
It would appear there's always more work to be done and a good deal more discussion. So that's why we're here. Welcome into our story. Welcome into the story of Forestry for the Future. We're going to explore that and more in coming episodes. This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.